Welcome to the Unlist. Today we will be discussing one of the most notorious flankers of a designer fragrance in recent memory. The range in question is the Gucci Guilty range, which started in 2009. Still going, by the way. And the flanker in question is this, Gucci Guilty Absolute, being the men's version, Absolute Pour Homme. There's also a women's version I'll touch upon in a little bit, but before I delve into the history, just the facts for all of you who want to get in and get out and then go whatever it is you're about to do with yourself. This came out in 2017. It was perfumed by Alberto Morillas, fairly well-known name in circles around here. And it represents a massive, massive departure from what Gucci Guilty was known for up until that point. And in some ways, still a massive departure for what the range is known for now with its current crop of flankers and concentrations. So this is definitely the black sheep, even though there was technically several fragrances in black bottles. Aesthetically speaking, not the black sheep, but scent-wise, definitely the black sheep. This fragrance could have just been released under a different name, with a different bottle and different marketing. It might have actually done better that way, honestly. It might have done better that way. This is another case where I don't understand why they would do this to this fragrance the way they did. Why not make it a unique launch? Similar to some of the CK1 flankers that I've seen that have less than no relation to the rest of the range. It makes you wonder if they just bought a formula off the shelf that another house didn't want and decided to shove it in a CK1 bottle and see what happens, right? Just for shits and giggles. Well, I kind of feel like maybe that's what happened here. There was a fragrance that was already being developed by Alberto Morillas, maybe one of his hobby fragrances, something he was doing on his own, right? Because he's a very commercial perfumer, but perfumers are still artists, and artists still create art. So maybe he was working on something on his own. Pierre Bourdon has done the same thing. Cool Water was a personal project of his, so maybe this was a personal project or something. Or maybe it was just a very uniquely open brief where he could interpret the brief however he wanted to. Whatever the case may be, Alberto Morillas had a lot of creative control over this from what I've read. And the result was a fragrance unlike basically anything else the range has. And one of the more notable releases among Alberto Morillas' entire career range. Now, bear in mind, Alberto Morillas is one of the most prolific perfumers in the industry. He has so many fragrances he's made. He has made so many fragrances, ridiculous numbers of fragrances. So among that massive body of work, this stands out as one of the more unique things he's done, which is saying something, right? He was not phoning it in with this one. Definitely not phoning it in. He was paying attention in class that day. He was firing on all cylinders. He drank his V8. He took his vitamins, okay? Maybe he didn't say his prayers. He's not Hulk Hogan, but he did everything else. And he walked away with this, a fragrance that is touted to have not one, not two, not three, actually three, yeah. I was seeing how long I could go with that. But this has 3 different kinds of patchouli in it, which this means 3 different patchouli fraction materials, not 3 distinct patchouli essences. That would clearly overload the fragrance. It would make it unwearable. But it has 3 different patchouli-derived materials in it. The primary focus of this fragrance, though, since we're still sticking with the facts right now, I'll get into the history a little later, but the primary focus of this fragrance is to be a leather and patchouli fragrance. So the idea is to have this sort of old school petrol leather smell, which if you're a fan of things like Fahrenheit by Dior, released in the late 80s, or anything like Gray Flannel, which has a very petrol-y kind of violet feel to it, even though it's not a leather fragrance. But those violet-derived petrol notes that Fahrenheit has in abundance, plus a certain other compound that the name of which eludes me right now, but that particular kind of compound that gives you that barrel note, petrol note, that is in this fragrance. Some folks also perceive it as a Band-Aid smell. I don't really see it as a Band-Aid smell. I mean, maybe iodine a little bit, like certain antibacterial sprays you might put on a wound. I can kind of get little vibes of that, but medicinal perhaps, but definitely not a Band-Aid itself. But the petrol vibes, it definitely has. The patchouli is there. Cedarwood is there to a degree. And of course, a very strong vetiver profile. There are people who actually consider this to be more of a vetiver fragrance than a leather fragrance. And even though I don't see it that way, I can understand how they would reach that conclusion. I can go, you know what? I don't see it, but I understand how you could see it. So it is different things to different people. To me personally, it is primarily a leather patchouli. I get the vetiver, I do, but for me, it's primarily leather patchouli. The vetiver in this, however, does give it a bit of a tenuous link to Terre d'Hermes, which came out 11 years prior. So sometimes when I want to wear Terre d'Hermes, but I'm a little bored of it, it's a little too quiet for my tastes, I want like a Terre d'Hermes that's been doing a cycle of steroids or something for a competition. You know, like Terre d'Hermes getting ready to be the next Mr. Olympia or something, then I will switch out for this. And this is my hulked up, you know, roided version of Terre d'Hermes, because it has those vetiver notes, it has those patchouli notes, but it has that big old slug of petrol leather that gives it that Lou Ferrigno busting through a wall kind of feeling. So anyhow, enough of that BS. You get the point. Nowhere in there, however, does that describe a typical Gucci Guilty fragrance. Am I wrong? Nowhere in that description, the Band-Aids, the leather, the petrol, 3 different kinds of patchouli, not 1, not 2, 3 different kinds of patchouli, all of this hirsute horniness going on. Nowhere in there does that describe your typical Gucci Guilty fragrance, especially not on the men's side. And that's both the beauty of this fragrance and also its downfall. So that's its blessing and its curse. Now we get to the history. So all of you dudes who don't care about this boring, nerdy stuff, you can click off now. We're going to hit it at the 8-minute mark. So we're going to go 3, 2, 1. History time. All right, so history time. What makes this fragrance so significant for collectors and enthusiasts, why it's so notorious, is the events leading up to its release. So those of you who know a thing or two about Gucci as a brand know that it's a very tumultuous brand. It's had a very checkered history. Unlike Chanel, unlike Dior, unlike Hermes, that seem like perpetuating dynasties of unchanging style. Hermes has always Hermesed. Chanel has always Chanel'd. Dior has always Diored, right? They are kind of known for what they are, for how they present themselves. But Gucci has always been a constant horse of a different color, always changing its stripes. Every time you turn around, one day it might be a tiger, next day it might be a panther. Over here it's something altogether unrelated. So Gucci is like, don't blink or you might miss it. That's how Gucci is. And the era when the family was still running the business was more conservative on some accounts, but also more flagrant, more ostentatious, depending on which member of the family was running it. It was Aldo at first when they got into perfumes with the original Gucci Pour Homme and the original Gucci fragrances composed by Guy Robert. They are amazing fragrances with very high quality materials, real sandalwood, lots of good stuff. They are now exorbitantly expensive, so you don't want to go after them unless you're a millionaire, you know, but it's a shame. They were very nice. They were just kind of conservative, and for the time, they were not very groundbreaking, so I can understand why they got overlooked and eventually forgotten and discontinued. Then the Maurizio Gucci era began, and Maurizio Gucci kind of patterned the Gucci fragrances more after what the French were doing at that time. So Gucci fragrances got really French into the 80s. Gucci Nobile was very much like a Drakkar Noir or Houbigant Duc de Vervins, very soapy, clean, green, aromatic fougere. All the women's fragrances that Gucci was putting out, like Gucci No. 3, L'Art de Gucci, they were very like ostensibly French styled chypres. They had the rose, they had the oak moss, they had that very classic construction to them. Then you get into the 90s, and after Maurizio was tragically killed by his wife, they made a movie about that you can watch if you want to learn all about that stuff. Then the Gucci house became the property of the banks. They kind of seized it. And the lawyer for the family, this is really messed up, but the lawyer for the family became the CEO, Domenico Del Sol, and he's still the CEO to this day. But so the lawyer ended up walking away with the company, with the deed to the company. And the family was kind of pushed to the side. And they own shares in the house, but they don't control it anymore. They haven't for decades now. So under his watch, we saw a restructuring, and Tom Ford was appointed. And those of you who are familiar with Tom Ford and all of his little predilections know that he kind of turned Gucci into a bit of a horror show for some people, others revolutionary. So the whole porno chic vibe with the clothing. The fragrances, on the other hand, were less controversial, but Tom Ford loves his retro styles. So most of the Tom Ford fragrances were patterned after classic Chanel's, patterned after Halston, patterned after a lot of things that he grew up enjoying. So Gucci had a bit of an identity crisis in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, where it felt like it was trying very hard to be like French houses, like the other French houses. In these regards to the fragrances, not the clothes. The clothes were on a different level. But the perfumes from Gucci at that time, Envy, okay, Rush, Envy for Men, Rush for Men, that whole thing, that whole era, all the way up to the rebooted Gucci Pour Homme and rebooted Gucci, and then they had a Pour Homme 2 as well. They were all very much just ostensibly classic, retro. And he did the same thing with YSL, okay? Same thing with YSL. So once he left and did his own thing and formed his own house under Estee Lauder, then the creative director underneath him, Frida Giannini, she was promoted up to main creative director, and she was damage control. She was assigned with the task to bring Gucci back down to earth and soften their image. And she might have softened their image a little too hard, because everything immediately shifted within a couple years to pastels, flower prints. All of the Tom Ford era stuff got discontinued and replaced with very clean, basic, boring, mostly tobacco Tonka type things with soapy notes on top for the men. Gucci by Gucci is an example of that. Just not super duper interesting. And then, of course, the theme shifted again. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, the economy had crashed, and the idea was to go after the young people, right? To try and go after all of those oligarch spawn and trust fund babies and all of the rich, detached, affluentic morons that drive daddy's BMW and hit pedestrians by accident because they're too busy on their phone while driving. Those kind of people, you know, the ones that eat up brands like Gucci, because anything that shows wealth and status, all of the hype beast people basically, Gucci wanted to go after them now. And eventually TikTok and stuff like that kind of fed into it, because then they could show off how rich they are on social media. So the Gucci Guilty range came into being around that time, 2009, 2010. And the fragrances were very youth-oriented, sweet, bubblegummy, soapy shower gel notes for the guys, raspberry truffle notes and stuff, and peach notes for the ladies, you know, just young boy, young girl, let's go to the mall, okay? Let's go to the nightclub. That was kind of where they were heading with the range. And the bottles, although classy looking, because they all have this same kind of hip flask design with different colors depending on the bottle, Classy bottles, nice little metal cap too. It's not plastic, man. It's not plastic. It's metal. Nice little quality caps, nice little quality bottles. But the smell just was not interesting. And because it wasn't interesting, it was just kind of there to serve that general purpose. A lot of the online people were like spirit crushed. They were heartbroken because they were used to the Envies and the Nobiles and all that stuff. All the real distinguished, refined, sophisticated, more like elevated designer styles. The more Chanel-esque, again, sort of stuff, Hermes, Dior type stuff. And now they were getting bubblegum, shower gel, patchouli notes over thin veneer of Ambroxan, whatever else, Tonka. And they were just like, man, this is just, what is this? This is like Abercrombie and Fitch with a Gucci logo slapped on it. And you can take me to the bank on that one. It's really what it was. It was A&F with the spray-on abs, but with a Gucci logo on it. Now, I like the fragrances. I have every single Gucci Guilty for men, and I will come clean. I own them all. I'm not ashamed to say it. I am not guilty of owning Gucci Guilty. I don't feel guilty at all. But I will say, for the average collector, for the average enthusiast, the guys who like their Colroses and their powerhouses or their artisanal things, or they like their niche things that are loaded down with animalics or whatever, they don't want this stuff. They clearly don't want this stuff. And if you're one of those rich guys with a bunch of money and you want like the fragrance to have a bling on it, like the Raja Dove with the big brass caps, Gucci is sort of too cheap. So they're in that weird middle ground where they're trying to be expensive and trying to be ostentatious, nouveau riche wealth, but only for the kids. See, the older guys, the guys who've got, you know, the BAs and they're working in the office and they're driving the Maseratis or whatever and they own the $1 million homes, this is beneath them. So they're going to move into the Creed, they're going to move into the Parfum de Marly, they're going to move into the Raja Dove stuff and pay that $400, $500 a bottle, and that's where they are. So this is for more like that fake it until you make it crowd, right? That's who this is for. This is for that fake it until you make it crowd. The guys who wear the sneakers and the tongue is all the way out on the sneakers. There's no laces. That's the kind of guy who wears this sort of fragrance. But not this one. Not this one. And this is where we get to how this kind of happened. Alessandro Michele replaced Frida Giannini in 2016. And the first thing he did was looked at all of her stuff and went, boring, and he threw it all out. He got tired of every single Gucci Guilty fragrance basically having the same DNA, but a little different. And let's be honest, that's what they were. The original Gucci Guilty in 2009 and its Intense counterpart, which got discontinued sadly, but the regular and the Intense were kind of two sides of one coin. Then we get the black version, which is a little bit soapier, cleaner, sportier maybe. Then we got the O version, which came out a few years after that, and that was just a little bit more peppery, a little bit sharper. Not necessarily, even though it says the word O, it's not lighter. It's not more watery. It's actually a little more peppery, a little sharper, less sweet. And then after those came out, you had your limited edition diamonds bottles and studs bottles and all the different decorated, but they were the same fragrances. He looked at that and he was like, I'm done. This is boring. So he threw all that away. O got discontinued. Black stayed. Intense got discontinued. So the original one and black were kept. Intense and O kind of bit the big one. And then he introduced, as his first new reboot, soft reboot on the Gucci Guilty range, he introduced this. And this is that 1970s. It's funny. This is more Tom Ford-esque than anything else. But Alessandro may have been tipping his hat to Tom Ford at the time. I don't really know. But if you're a fan of Yadigan and Phileas by Nina Ricci, if you're a fan of One Man Show, if you're a fan, again, of Fahrenheit, stuff like that, this is right up your alley. You will love this. This is definitely in that wheelhouse for you. This is 100% in that wheelhouse for you. So 2017 was like peak frag bro apocalypse. So Aventus hysteria was at its highest point in 2017. Dior Sauvage had only been on the market for 2 years. Baccarat Rouge 540 had only been on the market for 2 years. Parfum de Marly Layton was only 1 year old when this came out. So we're talking about the biggest, most overhyped compliment monster fragrances on the planet that all the bros could not shut up about. 2017. So this could not have appeared at a worse time. Could not have appeared at a worse time. But that's how little Alessandro Michel really cared about that stuff, right? And just the train kept a rolling. And this came out. It was followed by Oud, which Oud was funny. So the women's version I mentioned that I said I would talk about a little later in the video. The women's version was also a leather fragrance, but it was a leather fragrance where instead of getting like patchouli and vetiver and the petrol note, you get leather mixed with raspberry and rose. So it's like a fruity rose leather chypre. Very nice, actually. Guys can pull it off, in my opinion. Most guys won't touch it, but guys can pull it off. So the Oud fragrance was basically both of the absolutes combined. So you get the raspberry and the rose from the women's absolute. Then you get the leather patchouli from the men's version of absolute. And then you get an Oud note mixed into it. So it's both absolutes joined by a handshake of Oud. Boom. That's what it was. Good stuff. Didn't last very long. In fact, it only lasted for 1 year. So it was discontinued even faster than this. This actually lasted until about 2020. 3 years this was on the market. So it lasted a little while, but you know, that Oud was gone in 1 year. And then it was followed by Cologne, which is another Alberto Morillas composition. Cologne was even more strange because the Gucci Guilty Cologne Pour Homme had an old school heliotrope note in it. Okay? So think Guerlain, Apres Lande, Guerlain loves Baby Soft, anything with a soft heliotrope note like that, mixed with Neroli. So we get some sweet orange blossom Neroli in there, and then the heliotrope over a very powdery, sheer base. So very old school. Once again, misunderstood, discontinued in like a year. And then last but not least, the only one still on the books, actually, the only one still on the books is the Eau de Parfum, the Gucci Guilty Pour Homme Eau de Parfum, which is like a really strange, aquatic, salty rose fragrance with a bit of chili pepper in it. That kind of deserves its own video, so I won't touch upon that too much here. But all of the Alessandro Michel fragrances are in a different world from everything before. And now that we've got Sabato di Sarno, who took his place last year, all the things made by Sabato di Sarno up until present, so we're talking Parfum and Elixir, that era in between where this fragrance came out was once again another weird fever dream. If the Tom Ford era was a fever dream that lasted for about 15 years, this was like a little 5-year window of madness too. Like we had followed Alice down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, and we walked away with a very strange series of Gucci Guilty fragrances. And the notoriety of this will probably last forever. People were so sure this was going to be discontinued, they couldn't stop talking about how it was going to be discontinued. Even right after it released, literally months after it launched, people were like, oh, it's going to be discontinued, like right away. It's like we knew. We knew how weird this was. We were calling it before it even happened. So make of that what you will. Tell me what you think of this fragrance in the comments below, and thanks for watching.